Checking degrees of freedom of a component. So we can view the degrees of freedom of a component. To do this, we're going to go up to our View tab. We're going to go over to our Visibility panel. We're going to go to Degrees of Freedom. When I click on this Degrees of Freedom, it shows me basically 6 degrees of freedom. Now, there are 3 degrees of linear movement. There's one on the X, one on the Y, and one on the Z axes. And there's 3 degrees of rotational movement. So it spins around the X, it spins around the Y, and it spins around the Z. So you can see in this degrees of freedom marker indicator that there are 6 of them available. There's the linear arrows in each direction, and there's 3 circles going around those particular axes, X, Y, Z axes. So all the degrees of freedom are available for this one. As we apply assembly constraints, those movements are restricted, and so therefore they will not show up when we view these degrees of freedom. So as we remove each one, it does not show on the indicator. Now, if we were to say put a rigid joint in, and the rigid joint then eliminates all the movement of the degrees of freedom, it would no longer show any of these degrees of freedom. Also, when we go and we ground a component, a grounding of the component will cause it'll be fixed, it'll be frozen, and so there is no degrees of movement. So we can use this degrees of freedom button, and we can turn it on and off to see what our degrees of freedom are in our components. And this will help us with applying assembly constraints. So at any time I can turn them off, anytime I can turn them on and see where I stand in my degrees of freedom. So remember, grounding eliminates all degrees of freedom, and so when we apply our constraints, those degrees of freedom will go away bit by bit as depending on what assembly constraint we apply to the assembly.